So, from your listening to what Klavan was saying, did it seem to you fantasy literature was new to him?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Fantasy literature was new to him, meaning did he have like a deep knowledge of the way dragons and mythological creatures operated? Did he have a vast vocabulary for it, that kind of thing? Or
So, yeah, well, I'm sort of. I mean, fantasy is not real by definition. And so an elf in this universe is different. Like Harry Potter's elves are different than Tolkien's elves. You know, but when we're in Los Angeles, it felt kind of like Klavan bread and butter. It felt like
gotcha, yeah, true crime novels, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, now we're with an ogre. Oh, over here's a nymph. Oh, it's like kind of like
I felt here's how I felt about that. Now that you've mentioned the question and you've clarified, I think Klavan's fantasy world is actually kind of more along the lines of a C.S. Lewis fantasy world more than a Tolkien fantasy world.
Okay, well, just unpack that for a second. So, what I understand of Tolkien and Lewis was the fantasy that they were both writing was they were both doing something on purpose. Lewis was
that's not going to be as relevant to the point I'm about to make. Let me finish the point, and then we can maybe even talk about that a little bit. But the difference between Lewis and Tolkien that I'm pointing out is that Tolkien's main job in writing his epic works or whatever he's doing is to create a whole world with one overarching story for his particular purposes, which get pretty deep, and we can go into those.
But it's a consistent universe.
It was to create that consistent universe, have a place for everything, whereas C.S. Lewis, I don't think
Narnia
that mattered
has very
as much.
little to do with Out of the Silent Planet.
Those are two different things, but also just even within the world of Narnia, it didn't so much matter that the world was coherent. It ended up being that way because he's a good writer and everything, but and same with Klavan. It wasn't an incoherent fantasy universe, but the characteristics of the fantasy universe were products of what the needs psychologically and spiritually of the characters were. Like, for instance, that monster that is in the dungeon that's made up of the bodies of women, right, is obviously just talking about how communism created or defeminizes people, even in their pro-femininity, where you have women's marches in Russia before you ever had them over here. In communist Russia, you had women's marches. They are de-womanizing the women. And so in this garbage dump are the dresses and all of the actual female things about women. And so those corpses of all of that was creating this monster. And I think that's the important part of what Klavan's doing there, more than having that monster resemble anything from a particular type of mythological
the monster
universe.
he encounters in Galliana, the one in the castle, they're all
products
they all have a purpose, but they have a purpose
almost an allegorical purpose. Yeah,
allegory. That was actually where I was looking for with Lewis versus Tolkien. Tolkien was saying, this is pre-Christian English mythology that didn't exist, but we deserve it. Let's have one. Mm-hmm. And let's have one that actually extols the Christian virtues as opposed to the ones that probably would have been there if we really looked at what the Celts were doing. That would have been just like all the other pagans, which are self-aggrandizing and wicked.
Right.
And so creating Middle Earth...
it was creating a whole mythological universe, which was his point. And Klavan's not creating a whole... Well, he's creating a mythological universe for him, for that character. Right. It's
exactly.
like Narnia is where these kids of C.S. Lewis's would go. That was because their spiritual world.
The kids are growing up, and just like in Narnia, the story begins and ends with the kids. The story begins and ends with Austin, right? And this is all part of his spiritual journey.
Yeah, and that other world is real, but it's real in the sense of its connection to this world. It's not like you were saying, it doesn't begin and end in that mythical world, and that is the reality pre-civilization. It's this reality exists right now, kind of like a kingdom of God situation where you have just it
which Austin has
coexists.
that realization at the end of the story of when he's going back and forth. The emperor, when he and the emperor are kind of one essence for a time, he's able to see the spiritual realities going on in Los Angeles.
Right.
He's like, well, I guess these have been going on all the time. That's the skill I needed to have, was to be able to see the unseen.
Yeah.
And what he's kind of saying is, even after the emperor stays in, the 11 lands and he comes back to Los Angeles, that's still a skill he wants to have, sort of. And kind of seeing, wait, this person is on drugs. That's a demon that's kind of attacking them. This person has a rage problem. This person has a lust problem. That's a demon that's feeding on them.
That was a really interesting part of Klavan's theology, I thought, that I didn't see before in any of his other books. Because we had talked about before, and I wrote a review of his The Great Good Thing. And in that book, to me, he has a very kind of almost lighthearted view of sin. He talks about how he has, he kind of likes the rougher elements of humanity.
Grittiness, yeah.
The grittiness, yeah, that's a good word for it. And that seemed to me to resonate a very Catholic or medieval view of sin, where it's kind of like, oh, happy fault, those kinds of things where sin is viewed as, or Satan is made fun of for all of his foibles. And what's interesting in Another Kingdom is it seems to have a very much more puritanical view of sin.
I wouldn't say it's puritanical. So puritanical is
well,
more.
Here's what I mean. Let me tell you what I mean by puritanical, then I want you to criticize it. When I say puritanical, I'm talking specifically about John Milton's Paradise Lost view of humanity versus a Catholic view, which would have been captured in Dante's Inferno, where people are just kind of getting what they deserve in this happy world that's left over by God.
Like, people always talk about the Inferno. It's the Divine Comedy.
Right, it is a comedy.
Which the whole thing is a comedy. It's a good thing. Like, this hell is, well, yeah, that guy, but he cheated people in his life, so now he's getting cheated his whole eternity.
Yeah, exactly.
It's all kind of just an ironic.
Yeah. Contrapasso or something was the word I learned when I was going into it. But instead of that, Milton's Paradise Lost takes a very much more, sin is a lot more consequential. Like, we're in a battle currently against sin, and who wins matters all the time. And so that element of it was kind of interesting for me to see, because it seemed almost, I wasn't expecting it after seeing such a more playful view of sin in his other works. This one was like, you must oppose this, and when you're opposing it, you're actually fighting a spiritual demon and slaying it, kind of thing.
Yes, but it seemed that it was always. It wasn't that. I mean, Andrew Klavan believes in God, obviously, but in this story, it wasn't that there was a God as judge saying, "I am displeased with what you're doing. You will find recompense when you stand before me." It was, you're doing this is creating a demon that's eating you. Like, the virtue is liberty, right? You want to be free of that greed, because that greed is a tyrant that's got you in his clutches, like Curtin had Lord Iron in his clutches.
Oh,
he was not
Curtin,
free.
Yeah, I remember that. Sorry.
The very last one that I read, or the very last one that I listened to, it's like Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain. I've listened to the entire thing and it didn't click that. Oh, there's a.
That clicked for me actually in the scene that I was talking about with.
There's a communism metaphor going on.
Right. Well, the time, this was actually in season 2, I think, when he sees all the nameless, faceless people who are genderless and whatever else.
Right.
And he talks about he's in, I don't know, Edgemond or something. I'm trying to remember the names of all these places. But yeah, it was somewhere in there where I'm like, okay, this is totalitarian, the way totalitarian communism degenderizes, dehumanizes people.
So yeah, totalitarian communism, obviously, Klavan opposes, and the main villains are Iron and Curtin.
Yeah.
So there's a metaphor there the entire time, but what's fascinating about Klavan's writing is it's not just saying, here's the good guy, here's the bad guy, these are the Jedi, those are the Sith, these guys should win, these guys should lose, this guy's pro-peace, this guy's pro-war. It was more So why? So what's so bad about the communists? Just they're just greedy, money hungry, evil people. Like, no, what they're doing, they had a perverse incentive the whole time, but it wasn't exactly they were willing to dominate someone else in order to achieve the utopia that they thought. Right. It was, this will be good for you in the end. Suck up and deal with it. Where the virtue was always, let each man go his way.
Correct.
Like liberty, freedom.
Right. It was very much liberalism versus communism in his ethics,
right.
with one caveat that he added that let wisdom reign part.
Right.
Because it would have been pure liberalism versus communism if he hadn't had that.
Right. So the let wisdom reign is communism, like all other vices, is its own punishment. Right? It's like, so the children that are all trapped in the forest because their women, their mothers were never able to have them, right? Because they were that female monster that was down there, made up of all the... Because, why? Well, because Curtin had convinced this people to kill all of their women and just let the men take on feminine/masculine, genderless roles. He's like, you see that in the Soviet Union with the women's movement. Like, no, women can put on boots and work in a factory just like man. And we see that in our own feminism today. Like, well, maybe then you don't like women. You just want them to be men, right? Women
True.
don't tend to do that as much, And that's part of what Klavan's point, I think, very much the virtue that Austin learned was to fulfill my purpose, be who I am meant to be.
Yeah, it's true.
And the women were prevented from doing that because this other guy had this utopia he wanted to achieve. And back in Los Angeles, in our world, in the real world, Orozco is doing the same thing. And ironically, he's being controlled by the same wizard.
Now, you picked up on the Orozco. You had Iron and Curtain. You know what Orozco is, right?
Spoil it for me, no. Who's Orozco? What is it?
It's an anagram for George Soros.
Oh, of course.
I mean, come on. Orozco actually already has, you just take the G out of it, it's Soros. But the rest of it, I think it's Sergey, I forget what the first name is right now.
Serge Orozco is
something like that, yeah. But it's George Soros, anagram for him. Which makes sense, because he's the one peddling a lot of different...
but it's all...
far left-wing things.
But not just far left. It's like, you're going to love it, trust me. We're gonna make an omelet. We're gonna break some eggs. There's gonna be people that are killed, families that are destroyed. But the utopia on the other side is gonna be great.
Right. But I did like one thing. I think Klavan did that avoided what the left is going to criticize right-wing criticisms of Soros for being is always, it's anti-Semitic. I mean, first off, obviously Andrew Klavan is Jewish, so that's not going to stick really well. But he does also, by making the George Soros figure captured kind of by the demons, he's not doing what the Owen Benjamins of the world do by saying, no, the problem is this person, is these people. He's making the problem sin, which can get anyone, which I think is a huge...
Which is what the final victory for Austin was forgiving Iron.
Right. Was
him saying, I hated Iron. That's what gave Curtin the power over me, why I couldn't defeat him. Once I saw Curtin behind the curtain, I was able to say, I don't hate him, I pity him.
Right, yeah.
And that's kind of like when he watches Serge Orozco get eaten by that serpent and get swallowed into the hell he had just himself escaped from. It's like, this whole time I was terrified of this guy, I hated this guy, I resented him, he had taken my family, like nothing but pity for the poor man as he's being devoured by his own lust and greed for power,
Right, and that's very important, I think, so that you don't get caught in one of many, many ideologies, especially that the right are prone to, which is that scapegoating thing, which is
if only we could get at these people. Yeah. They're the ones.
I'm trapped by pornography because those guys decided that they're going to trap our culture in pornography. It's like, no, you are a human. You have sin, and the culture, as all cultures do, are going to enable whatever sins that the people in that culture are prone to. So blaming blaming the sin rather than the sinner is, I think,
virtue,
a huge element of that.
For Klavan and for Austin Lively, virtue was overcoming these vices for the sake of my own liberty. Right? I have liberty because I'm no longer enslaved to this vice. Right? And that's the let wisdom reign part. Once you're able to be virtuous, then each man can go his way. Austin is not controlled by the emperor in a way. So Austin being controlled by the emperor is the mirror image of iron being controlled by curtain.
Okay.
Austin still has his autonomy. He has to say, no, emperor, I'm trying to do this, but I don't have the sword skill to do it. I have to concentrate and let you have control here. But his normal thing is let me think, let me make my decision, let me listen to wise counsel, and let me go forward and each man go his way. So the emperor is there with him, and it's kind of a picture of the difference between in the biblical concept of the way the demoniac would be controlled by it often casts him into the fire, and nobody can drive out this demon. But Paul says, walk by the Spirit, and you won't carry out the desire of the flesh. Be not drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. The Spirit is in you. He is a part of you. He even is in control. He's the boss, right? But you never lose your autonomy. You never lose your liberty. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty, right? The man is still an autonomous being, where the malevolent force has a greater good that you are just a stepping stone to get to, right? And so when he controls you, and it's hard to say for Klavan, because obviously in this world there's Curtin is a sentient being, right? And a lot of these malevolent forces are like, well, there's lust, but it's kind of a personified creature eating him. It's hard to say whether that actually reflects Klavan's actual Satanology, whether he would say, no, there are actual demons. There's a lust demon that's got a hold of you. Or is it just the kind of abstract way of describing what happens when a man is overcome with lust and can't have the virtue of chastity, and it eats away at his liberty and he becomes bound by it. I might say both things are true, but that concept of liberty and virtue walking hand in hand, I think, was kind of one of the main messages of the story.
Yeah, I think so too. Do you think he goes too far in one of the either directions? Like I like that the two parts of the phrase are let wisdom reign and each man go his own way, or go his way, and then let wisdom reign part he intentionally caveats throughout the thing by saying it is placing the highest goods above all other goods.
And the way you phrased it there, because I remember when we were discussing this a few weeks ago, you said his own way, and I corrected you, and I had to prove it to you by looking it up. His way implies a creator there's a telos. This is not your own way. You don't get to pick.
Yeah.
Right. Austin, if he got to pick, he'd be still betting Hollywood starlets in Hollywood, when he kind of unbeknownst to him took Curtin up on his offer and got the movie deal, and had to kind of remember himself back to Galliana. So if he were to pick his own way, that's where he'd go. But that wasn't the emperor's.
Right, go his way, which is
his way was your created purpose, and and so there's a kind of the atheistic libertarian Klavan is protected from by his Christianity. It seems that it's very much libertarian. It's the liberty is kind of the highest virtue in the 11 lands, but it's go his way as opposed to his own way, because wisdom reigns, and there's not a God figure, but it's kind of the way the emperor interacts with Austin is kind of the way that Christian God interacts with the person.
Well, that's definitely what we're struggling with on the right now, is as we get all of these liberty-loving leftists fleeing a party that has gone too
totalitarian
much
left.
As we gain some of those, and as we deal with the fact that we've retreated into libertarianism as a party, largely because of our losses on social issues, we're struggling. The Republican Party is struggling with that exact thing. Is liberty itself the good? And if we make liberty itself the good, what does that do to our culture? And our culture seems to swing towards the idea of going its own way. And how does conservatism recapture an idea of the good? And the different ways that you go about doing that, right? Sohrab or Amari would have a different view of how a culture pursues the highest good versus versus, I don't know, some other different...
The David French libertarian conservative.
Right. But they both think that they're pursuing a higher good in their own ways. David French says you do it outside the state, and Sohrab says no, you do it through the state. So we're right now in the Republican Party, I think, thinking through the very issue that Klavan...
And Klavan was doing exactly what he's always been preaching, which is don't write an article on First Things or National Review like Amare and French did and just say your point. Make some art. Ingrain it in the person's soul, And I think, and with listening to Knowles and Klavan talk about the project, and they've had their little interviews that they've thrown in the middle of their releases of the story. They both kind of seemed like, almost embarrassed to say they feel like they're doing God's work. Like, yeah, the devil was really trying to prevent this from happening. Like, I wouldn't have said that if it wasn't for the fact that all these things happened right at the same time and seem to be trying. There seems to be a malevolent force trying to prevent this from coming out. But yeah, it seems like Klavan's got an answer. He's like, look, we have to have the liberty lovers. Whoever they voted for in 1996, they should all be on the same team now because we all understand the virtue of liberty. But you can't have each man go his own way. You have to let wisdom reign.
Well, have we thought, this is, I guess, one, I don't know if it's criticism of Klavan's work, but it's a criticism of the right generally, that have we really thought through the virtue side of that as much as we need to going forward?
Well, there's differences of opinion. Like, Andrew Klavan is to the left of the middle of the right, if you will, on those social issues questions. And it comes out in the work. There's a lesbian character that's friends with Austin, that's in love with Jane also. And she has these womanly attributes that are kind of having an awkward time coming out when she takes care of Austin. She always has to kind of insult him as she's taking care of him. But she's obviously, like, he's like, we have to have room for her. Right. She has to be able to go her way, as this lesbian, where, the fundamentalist evangelical right is tradition. No, she needs to be converted, and go the correct way, not her way, and his sexual ethics throughout the story are not puritanical in the least,
right?
But that's his answer, liberty is part of that.
Well, that's kind of where. Well, let me try to probe on that and see if I can get you to talk about that a little bit more. Because going his way, and versus going his own way. When you were talking about it earlier, you were like, Klavan says, no, it's not a going his own way. It is a going his way, which is the way he was created for. Now, that division sounds nice, but just apply that to the uncomfortable issues that are not, we don't always want to talk about. How do you differentiate what is my own way versus a way that I was created for? Does your biology matter? Does what your
proclivities?
Does what your body was designed for have something to do with what you were created for? And that's kind of the thing where I think is where we need to go on the culture and be thinking more about, is because I think conservatism is almost fine on the point of liberty. We all are now in agreement in liberty since Reagan. We saw the Soviet Union. We realized that liberalism is preferable to totalitarianism.
Our generation, I was 6 when the Berlin Wall came down, right?
Right.
So we remember people talking about it.
True.
Our kids will not.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
Like what Klavan is saying.
But I don't think our culture has moved less towards liberty since then. And I think here's maybe a point that maybe I'm not even sure if it's a criticism, but communism.
That might be a disagreement you have with Klavan, because I think Klavan does fear the totalitarianism of the left rising up. And I think you fear the totalitarianism of the right.
I do fear the totalitarianism of the right, but I think the totalitarianism of the left is a symptom of individualism. And I don't think Klavan does. And I think the left, I think the liberals borrow some conservative arguments in their criticisms of communism. Like William F. Buckley, in his Conscience of a Conservative book, he starts off by saying, no, the problem with communism is that it is spiritually deadening. It is spiritually better for you to be able to hold the product of your labor.
Right.
It is not. It doesn't matter that you get more stuff when you're when you have freedom versus communists, where you
an argument Ralph Nader would say, fine.
Yeah,
that's true.
And so that I think is a conservative argument. It's a spiritual one, and Klavan seems to kind of make both liberal arguments, where just freedom itself is a good, at the same time having some of the conservative arguments as well. And I'm trying to, I don't know, I guess maybe I haven't thought through Klavan's particular theology as much as I should, but the divide in conservatism definitely seems to be that. Liberalism, you end up with a kind of a intellectual dark web type conservatism, or you end up with a more Christian type conservative view on, and that divide in the right, I don't think has been really fleshed out. And maybe Klavan's doing that actually, because he's united both. He always has been libertarian.
Klavan's the only one who can do an interview on the 700 Club and a gay and lesbian magazine the next day.
I think you're right on that.
He would fit in fine with either.
Right.
Right?
But it's not. It's more than
but
that.
I think
that can happen. A Machiavelli can do that. Like somebody can be just philosophically cosmopolitan and be able to be okay and facilitate himself in all environments. That's not what Klavan is, I don't think. I think he'd be comfortable in both
that's what I'm
environments.
saying. I'm saying Pat Robertson could talk to him about the great good thing.
Right, yeah.
And his conversion to Christianity and his Christian experience, and give a lot of hearty amens.
Yeah.
He could go to Liberty University and speak, and he wouldn't just be one that they're tolerating to get more diverse views. He would be one of them.
Yeah.
Right? But he agrees with the Democratic Party on the gay marriage question,
Right, sure.
And so I think, but it's not that, I don't think he's making either point in the book. He's saying...
Well, I just wonder if those two parts of that phrase, which I think he's right that those two phrases need to be there in what our conservatism going forward. I just wonder if we need to flesh that out more.
No,
we need to flesh out.
I definitely think we need to flesh that out.
Like on the freedom side of it, for instance, there I think is there's even on just the side of the freedom thing, before we talk about what virtue is, there seems to be a divide on what constitutes the kind of freedom that is important. What is and I love the way he actually puts it in Another Kingdom. He talks about how you need to be willing to say no. Do you remember that part? Mm-hmm. He's like, the freedom you have is to say no to, or the power you have is to say no to whatever the thing was. And because he didn't say no, then
I didn't say no.
Yeah, and then the guy got the power. That power to say no is a kind of, I think, conscience freedom that may be different in some way from the just
the
ability
Ayn Rand
to
libertinism. I can just do cocaine.
We need to be thinking through what is the important part of that. Why is religious liberty in the Constitution, but the ability to imbibe pornography is not? Right. This one is an important thing for every individual to have. This is not, and so figuring out that side of the equation of what constitutes a true liberty is something I think we need to flesh out. And I may have to go back through Another Kingdom again just to see if I catch more ways in which he deals.
I think he's intentionally leaving it. Klavan has said a number of times, he's like, he'll make the Defense of Marriage Act argument. It's like, look, the man-woman relationship is the basis of the family, which is the nucleus of the society, and all literature and music and poetry all has that yin-yang type relationship at its core, and to allow the marriage relationship to dissolve would be detrimental to society. He's like, I see that argument. I don't agree with it, but he agrees with it to a degree.
Yeah.
But this man, he exists. He has sexual appetite that is not fit within that marriage relationship, and we can have a form of marriage that allows him to have the kind of productive, healthy, happy life that this man and woman are able to have. And if we just tweak the traditional understandings of these institutions enough to let him in the tent, then we can keep the society, and it'll actually promote more liberty rather than less. If we just say, no, this is the definition of marriage, let that guy be a libertine, because that's all that's left for him, is to be outside of this institution, well, you've actually given him less liberty. And that I think would be the argument he's making. But I think, like in the book, there's at least 3 LGBTQRSTU characters. The Sarah, which he always uses the masculine pronoun to refer to him, even though he's obviously a transgender. You remember he had a nickname for him, Babyface or something, before he found out the name. Right. It was transgender. But he was a tortured soul, obviously, that Orozco had just totally manipulated and used his own lusts against him. And it wasn't like you'd see on modern Hollywood, where they're always going to be the hero. Their sexual ethics are always going to be celebrated, and whatever libertine thing they're doing just needs to be affirmed. That's the highest of all virtues. But they weren't fundamentalist Christian either. Right. Like, it wasn't just they need to, they'll have a conversion experience that's then going to make all their bad desires go away. That wasn't the characters either. I think he's intentionally saying, let wisdom reign. And we have to figure out what that means for questions of sexual ethics. And then let each man go his way. It's going to flow from how we answer that question. I don't think he was giving an answer to that question. I think he was kind of just letting that hang there, because it hasn't been answered right now on the American political right, at least.
What'd you make of the last line of the whole thing, where he goes, "My only weapon now that's left," I'm going to butcher it, but the only weapon I have left is to tell my story.
In what I actually think he's saying is somewhat different than my first reaction to it. Maybe they're related, but my first reaction to it was, I thought of just the concept of speech and testimony, and the way that the Apostle Paul phrases it in 1 Corinthians is, we communicate spiritual truths to spiritual men, or spiritual. It's really just spiritual to spiritual things to spiritual men. And the natural man cannot perceive them because they're spiritually discerned. It's like saying the experience with the divine, with God Himself, with the Spirit, is communicated by testimony. You testify of these things. What Jesus said of Him and John the Baptist, we speak of what we know and we bear witness of what we have seen, but you have not accepted our testimony. That the 4 stories of Jesus are called the Evangelion, the Gospels, and it's just the proclamation of the truth, the proclamation of the message is the way that spiritual things are communicated. You can't just drill them into people. They have to be spiritually discerned by you just testifying of the truth, right? This was my experience. And the person says, the way that he phrases it in 1 Corinthians 11, or in 1 Corinthians 12 rather, how can the one, he's talking about speaking in tongues, if there's not a translator, if you're just doing this miraculous thing where you're speaking in another language, but this one doesn't understand, has no discernment, how can he give the amen? Like there's a yes, the Spirit that's in me testified of the truth of what you just shared. And that's how spiritual truths are communicated, by testimony. That was my first thought when he's saying, I have a weapon. It's not a sword anymore, but I can tell the story. I can tell my story. Where I think Klavan's was maybe something along the lines of that, but what I think he was saying was, the culture war is fought. Like you can't just go out and preach, hey, totalitarian communism killed a lot of people. Like, well, a lot of things from history books have killed a lot of people. Like, that's not fresh enough in people's minds anymore. But if you tell a story where the main bad guy is a totalitarian tyrant who has some utopian age that he's trying to accomplish, and he's willing to bend your will to his to get you there, you can instill the values in people where the way that preaching at them wouldn't have. So for him, I think he's doing what Austin is doing. It's very autobiographical, up to the point where he's like, I can't probably work in Hollywood anymore, even though I love the movies. That is Andrew Klavan. Right, he is one of the great novelists in the country.
And the depictions of him in the, and I think the second season was kind of artistically drawn or whatever. They kind of looked like Klavan a little bit.
Looked more like Klavan than Knowles, who's acting him out. But I can't work in Hollywood anymore, but I can tell my story. He's like, well, you're not going to make a movie out of your story, so I guess I'll make a podcast and have my buddy actor Knowles perform it. He's like, that's how you win. You don't win by endorsing the right political candidate.
Right, yeah.
He's like, that's downstream. The right political candidate will be there when the right people believe the right story. I think that's kind of that was kind of what I think his conclusion was there. And for me, it was there's a spiritual component, I think, that for Klavan it's there, but I don't think it's as overt to him. Kind of like we're talking about the curtain is an actual person, and the spirits that are kind of eating that these people are actually there. Kind of in another kingdom they're there, but I don't know if he's saying kind of like the way that a fundamentalist Christian like I would say, which the devil is very much real and the demons are very much real, and there's a very real spiritual warfare going on. But it's not just virtue, it's not just wisdom. There's actually a God. There's actually a person of the Holy Spirit that's just as much a person as those demonic spirits are. And he communicates with you the way that Athanasius was able to communicate with Austin. He works through you the way Athanasius was working through Austin. And the way that you persuade, the way that you bring others into communion with him is by telling the story, by proclaiming the evangelion, by pricking up and saying the truth of it. And the spiritual things are discerned by spiritual men. That's the method. Where, as opposed to it just being, well, vice is its own punishment, and virtue is kind of this abstract good that just kind of means having liberty and doing that which is necessary to promote liberty. It's like, well,
I think Klavan's doing what you were saying in the first place. I mean, because his big critique of Christian art
is that cheesy.
Is that it's cheesy. It tells the gospel story in such a cornball, cotton candy kind of way that it never sinks into anyone's heart, because they don't identify with any of the characters. They don't let themselves get absorbed into a story which has no relation to their reality. So I think in this particular story, for sure, he definitely showed, in my opinion, the pleasures of sex, the pleasures of power. He definitely, his character believably was like on top of the world, and every male who was listening to that podcast could identify with Austin's feelings in the first couple episodes. And that, I think this vindicates Klavan in some way. I don't think a cotton candy version of that would have been able to hit somebody who's listening to this in quite the same way. I think that's also the difference
between his theology and the theology of those who make those kind of movies. I resonate with cheesiness. Like when the cornball, not so much, but like those cornball movies, the parts that really touch me are the parts that I'm like, man, an unbeliever would be really awkward right now. It's like, oh, they're having a Bible study and this kid started crying and now they're all, praying with each other. Like, I've actually been in that situation, and it's foolishness unto men.
Yeah.
But that's what Paul says. The gospel is foolishness. There's an implied theology in the cheesiness is that ye must be born again. Like there has to be a conversion. There has to be a very dramatic change, fundamental change.
Well, I don't think Klavan disagrees with that. I think Klavan might think the change has a different effect than you do.
A different effect, but it's more so. Let's use the Apostle Paul as an example. In Acts 9, he has his conversion experience. Right. He's on the Damascus road to go throw a bunch of Christians in prison, and now suddenly he's preaching the Christian gospel in the same Damascus he was going to. Radical transformation.
Yeah.
But he's still quoting the Old Testament in all of his letters. Right? He's still the Pharisaical tradition that he grew up in. God picked him for a reason. He picked fishermen to do one thing. Like Peter and James and John have a ministry, but it's not the one that Paul had, because they didn't have the education Paul had. Right? And so there's a connection between the pre-conversion person and the post-conversion person, despite the radical change that has taken place. You haven't become a different person. You're a new creation in the spiritual sense. But I think that radical, so that's a part where we both agree. The Austin Lively, who's the kind of washed up Hollywood actor, maybe not washed up, wannabe Hollywood actor at the beginning of the movie, and the dragon slaying hero at the end of the movie, that change happens by circumstance over time as the story unfolds for him, right? He didn't have a Damascus road in the story. He just walks through the door and suddenly he's here, and now he's having to go his way. He's kind of figuring it out and finding what his real purpose is and finding what he's really created to do, right? And in so doing, he's loving virtue and he's hating vice, because vice enslaves and virtue liberates. But for the Apostle Paul, the Spirit of the Lord liberates, right? Not abstract virtue.
Right.
Right? And so there needs to be, like Nicodemus doesn't come to Jesus and say, you're a teacher come from God. We know you're doing these powerful signs. Jesus say, good. Let me ask you some Socratic questions to keep you on your journey that you'll content you eventually getting toward the good. Stop, Nicodemus. I'm not a teacher come from God. These signs that I'm doing are not vindicated. You need to be born again. Let's start there. Right? It's like, how can a man be born when he's old? You're a teacher of Israel. You don't even know what I'm talking about. Me and John the Baptist come. We testify of things. I testify of heavenly things because I'm come from God. You need to be born again. Like, you've thrown off my entire life. Yeah, exactly. As soon as you come to me and are willing to forsake mother, father, sister, brother, even your own very life, you can't be my disciple. Goodbye. That is that kind of, that's the Acts 9 experience, right? That for Klavan, and that's why I think like the cheesy videos, he's like, you're not reaching anybody. It's because they don't sympathize with that. They sympathize with betting Hollywood starlets. That's what they really want to do. Mm-hmm. They being in a gritty bar talking to somebody about how your movie script got rejected. That they'll really sympathize with that. The God's Not Dead people, or the Fireproof marriage movie people, like of course they don't sympathize with this. They haven't been born again. We're just testifying of what we know. And the spiritual things are discerned spiritually. And you might actually even see a tinge of the puritanical Calvinistic background of those movements, that we just preach. And if the Holy Spirit of God will draw them to it or not. And I obviously don't go that far. I think there is truth in both camps. But the fact there's not that kind of fundamentalist, you're going to turn. You're going to go from darkness to light. It's more of a steady growth into learning to love virtue as it liberates, knowing that it liberates you. I think reflects the distinction between Klavan's.
Yeah, and that might have something to do with why Let Wisdom Reign is the version of the good that he puts in there. Liberty plus this kind of idea of the good as something that I think is I mean, at some point, all of the Daily Wire people were reading Alasdair MacIntyre's virtue ethics, and it probably ties into that, the idea that the virtue, by acting virtuously, you become more virtuous, and it's this kind of movement.
And it's its own reward.
Right.
Just like vice is its own punishment.
I'd love to get Klavan's thoughts on that, to see if he thinks those two things are the same, or if he just views conversion as something that does kind of happen over time.
And that's what I think. I don't think. And what's weird is because.
Well, hold on. Let me just probe you on one thing, because you said specifically, and you pointed to where Jesus said you must be willing to reject your family. Klavan is saying something in Another Kingdom where his desire or his willingness to sacrifice his own will and his own goods for family members, especially his younger sister, are elements that drove him in a direction that he associates with his conversion to Christianity.
But also his willingness to reject his mother, father, and brother. Like
True.
He sacrifices everything for his little sister, but there's something like she's an innocent victim.
True.
He's like, he could have easily just kept his Hollywood job and kept all of his money, kept betting all of the starlets, and still been in good relations with his brother and his mother and his father. But he knew that wasn't the good. That wasn't letting wisdom reign. But yeah, it's not that they're not really that different. I don't think anybody would say that it's all one or the other. There's of course maturity and growth.
Yeah.
But there's also, I think in Klavan's own testimony, there's little he didn't have a Damascus Road experience. He's just like a 55-year-old man and wakes up one. He's like, I guess I should get baptized. I'm a Christian by now. Like, of all these thoughts I've had driving on this road over the time. you know, most people's conversion experience is not that way.
Well, I think, but would you give to Klavan the idea that for most people, there is showing them the pearls and casting them before swine, in the case of the Fireproof movie or whatever the kinds of movies are that you're talking about that you like, that do touch you because you've been in the prayer meetings where spiritual stuff happens.
And it's awkward. You just, gosh, the unbeliever really wouldn't get this.
They would say
this is the cheesiest thing in the world.
I know.
It's kind of like...
would you give him the point that spiritual warfare is going on in the world that's not the only place where spiritual warfare is happening?
Sure.
It is happening in the casting couch, like where the demons are there, and giving someone the ability to see something, to giving the person the imagination to see a spiritual warfare happening in that environment.
Right, and I think Klavan's talked about this a number of times, the great awakening that's happening in academia, and that thinking people are starting to see the hollowness, the nihilism of the materialism that they've inherited. And there's actually a lot of them having, more than just Klavan, who are kind of waking up, realizing, I kind of believe in God now.
This might be why Klavan's interested in a lot of the romantic authors, too. There's something dead about that mechanical world that you get from that kind of worldview. And enchanting it. I even forget, Austin Lively called it haunted at one point.
Right.
When I forget exactly even how it happened, but he went back to the real world and forgot everything because he
didn't say no.
He didn't say no, yeah. When he did that and then he just forgot everything, he first felt like the world was haunted. It was like a negative thing that was like spooking him. And he didn't want even to, it was a scary thing. But that was ultimately the world that would save him as well from where he was, from his just descent into sin. He was, it started off as just haunting, but it's actually enchanted. It's a world where God and goodness and that entire spiritual world actually exists, which the the secular liberalism, the go his own way, the way of the modern academia is completely disenchanted. The Brett Weinsteins of the world, they do not live in an enchanted universe, even though they're joining the Republican side of the aisle in some ways. The classical liberals of that ilk do not have this. They do not have the idea that there is a spiritual world.
No, they say there's no ghost in the machine.
Right, exactly.
And Klavan's talked about it a number of times. He's like, why do you say I had an adrenaline rush? No, you got excited. You're not just the product of your biology. It's like, if you just measure inside here, you'll see why I'm smiling right now. Like, no, you're happy about this event. That's what's going on. The physiology inside there is happening too. But the reality is that that's a person, and you love that person.
Yeah, and I think that may be some point of where the real distinction is between what is the classical liberal side, the ones who are refugees from the left, but who are basically remain secular, and the ones who are converted, like Klavan, from that. Yeah. There's a big difference.
Which is why I remember when the Jordan Peterson was a guest on the Daily Wire backstage one time. Klavan pressed him on the God question. And, it's the most frustrating thing by far about Jordan Peterson is his refusal to answer that question as though he's being an intellectual. Well, I act as though there's a God. And who could even say that they believe? What does it mean to believe? Klavan recognized that Peterson doesn't really have anything to say to Sam Harris until he's willing to take that step that there is a ghost in the machine, that you are a spirit, who has an earth suit around it.
Yeah, that's where Daily Wire, I think, all agree. That's the one point at which they all differ from what would be the generic classical liberalism that's secular. Right. They all have, every single one of the Daily Wire masthead has the belief in the ghost in the machine. There is some soul there that matters, and its freedom is what's the issue, not the bodily freedom. Maybe that's it. Maybe that's where Klavan differs from what I was thinking that the liberalism could become. It's not a bodily freedom. Right. It is a soulish freedom. It is a freedom of the spiritual man. It's time to think
The Think Outside Politics podcast is produced by Norman Young. Executive producer, Norman Young. Senior producer, Norman Young. Our supervising producer is Norman Young. And our technical producer is Norman Young. Edited by Norman Young. Audio is mixed by, you guessed it, Norman Young. Hair and makeup is done all by ourselves, and you can probably tell. The Think Outside Politics podcast is a production of ThinkOutsidePolitics.com.
I don't know if you can. Who's more far gone, Brett Weinstein or Ocasio-Cortez on that front? I think Brett Weinstein is. I think Ocasio-Cortez is more likely to end up believing in the spirit, that human beings are spirits with some kind of innate dignity that brings you, than a Brett Weinstein who has this complete, or a Steven Pinker who's got this completely secularized worldview. We're all just brains and neurons and whatever else that particular type tends to believe.
I don't know. Sometimes you just got to see it. Jesus appears to Paul on the Damascus road. Why persecutest thou me? Who are you, Lord? I'm Jesus, whom thou persecutest. I'm forever changed. I'm different, And that's kind of the evangelical in me. It's like, I got a story to tell.
So you think they're kind of equally likely?
Yeah.
The intellectual is just as equally
maybe that's
likely.
the Calvinism I was raised with that I've come to reject, but that you got to just tell the story.